This is the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Podcast, Episode 28, Managing Water at the Edge of the Field with Saturated Buffers. I'm Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason. Brian Arch serves as the Executive Director of the Illinois Land Improvement Contractors Association. He joined us to talk about saturated buffers and how they're put into place. I started by asking him just exactly what it is that he does.
Well, my background is biology and environmental studies, but I've been in ag here for over 10 years, doing everything from resource conservation work to ethanol production, so kind of the full gamut of the ag arena.
What do the members of the Land Improvement Contractors Association do?
So our members started off really back over 60 years ago here in Illinois as earth mover contractors. Run excavators and bulldozers out on the landscape. And since then, our members offer all kinds of services from drainage to landscape to concrete work. So a little bit of everything.
One of the things that they certainly will have been used to taking a look at and trying to put in place is a saturated buffer. Can you tell me what that is?
Sure. Saturated buffer is really one type of conservation drainage practice, or edge of field practices are known. That's really used to implemented to reduce nitrate losses from subsurface tile drain systems. And the way they do that is they take the subsurface tile drainage water that would normally outlet directly into a ditch or a surface water and redirect that back into the soil profile under a vegetated buffer strip that's parallel to the ditch or the surface water. And by doing that, you create a saturated soil profile that's really the perfect environment for soil microbes already inherent there in the soil to remove the nitrates from that drainage water, which they do just by converting the nitrates to nitrogen gas, which is an inert gas that makes up most of our atmosphere. So the whole process is really accomplished with a water control structure. And for those that aren't familiar with a water control structure and what that is, it's essentially a watertight vertical box that has removable dividers that we call stop logs or weirs. So we can take this water control structure, bury it subsurfacely, and tie it into the existing outlet. And then by raising these weir boards, we can essentially divert water into newly installed tile lines or lateral lines installed parallel to the ditch. So that allows the tile water that would normally outlet to be diverted into the lateral lines where it actually seeps back in and infiltrates the soil profile, allowing those nitrates to be removed.
The laterals must be perforated in that case.
Correct.
What are the site considerations for farmers interested in implementing this kind of buffer?
So there's a few site considerations, but probably one of the most critical is soils. So the soils need about 1.2% organic matter at a minimum in the top 2.5 foot of soil. What that does is that indicates a strong carbon presence, essentially for those microbes to work as they kind of break down and consume that carbon, allows them to breathe in those nitrates and exhale that nitrogen or convert it to nitrogen. So it's also critical that within that saturated buffer soil profile, that the soil conditions are just such that you can hold a water table. So there needs to be some sort of restrictive layer or high existing water table in that area that's really free of any, sand pockets or gravel lenses, where water that is pushed out into the laterals and into that profile, would have a chance to bypass, through one of those ununiform soil types. So it's important we have that water table to, again, allow that slow percolation out of the lateral lines. Bank stability is a big consideration as well with saturated buffers. So, we want to make sure there's not a lot of bank erosion or sloughing of the banks. They should be vegetated and have a nice little slope to them. And then we don't want banks that are incised, really over 8 foot. And again, the thought there is that if you're going to be saturating that soil profile, you don't want to create any more instability along the bank. Some other things to think of in terms of placement on the landscape is these are really most cost effective if you have the opportunity to treat up to about 15 acres at a minimum. It really makes them a little more cost effective. And so also on that tile system, it's important not to have any surface intakes or very few surface intakes. The thought there is that we can reduce any additional soil or debris inputs into the system. We wouldn't want that to hinder any of that filtration out into the saturated buffer. And then, of course, you really need, that 30-foot minimum vegetated buffer along your surface water ditch. So whether that's an existing vegetated buffer or that you have, confirm that you have room to install at least 30 foot. So beyond that, I think, one other thing that works well for saturated buffers is if you can get them placed a little lower on the landscape than your contributing tile acreage. Reason being, not to say you can't put them on flat slopes, but we do, raise that water table to get the functionality of the saturated buffer to push water into the lateral lines. So if it's a little bit below the rest of your field, that helps from raising the water table maybe into your cash crop on the last couple rows or something. So if that's if you're not after drainage water management, that's certainly a situation we don't want.
This is an active rather than a passive system, meaning it does take some work during the year to manage it.
It does, yes. They're great practices. They can remove anywhere from 25 to 40% of the nitrates. There's data that shows they can remove over 80%. So they're fairly low maintenance systems, which makes them attractive as well. But yes, there is some management involved, and that really comes in the form of managing those weir boards, the height of those weir boards. So again, similar to like a drainage water management situation, for those that are familiar with that, you would lower or remove your weir boards about 2 weeks before planting or before harvest to lower that water table to make sure you can get into the field and do what you need to do, and then essentially replace those weir board settings for the functionality of your saturated buffer during the growing season so that you get that nitrate removal.
And it does still continue to allow the tiles to run if there are large rainfall events?
It does, exactly. So yeah, this is a fail-safe system, and it will never actually back up your current free flow drainage system. So that may sound a little counterintuitive, but under normal drain flow conditions, we can divert most of that tile water into the saturated buffer laterals to get that nitrate removal. But these systems are designed, on about a 5% minimum full flow drainage capacity. So meaning when that system's running full flow, we're only treating about 5% of that system. So during high flow events, we're not actually capturing, can't possibly push all that volume of water through the saturated buffer. So what happens in that instance is the excess water that couldn't go into the saturated buffer literally just overtops the weir board setting and would go out the same outlet as if there were no structure in place before. So again, we're never backing up that water system. We're just diverting it to get the flow we need. But again, in heavy rain events or large flow situations, it's simply going right back out of the outlet untreated.
What are the typical costs for installation?
Good question. So typical cost range is anywhere from $4,000 to $8,000. It's a big range, I know, but it really depends kind of on the linear footage of the lateral installation on the bioreactor as well as the structure type. So obviously the more lateral you can install on your property, the more opportunity you have to get that on your property, the more tile costs would go up just based on linear footage. And then structure type, there is a couple different designs for saturated buffers, and that mostly hinges on whether or not a producer wants to utilize drainage water management in conjunction with a saturated buffer. So there's different types of control structures that can be used there.
Are there share cost opportunities?
There is. So actually there's quite a bit what you would think of as maybe the traditional cost share opportunities. So through the FSA with the CRP program, they have some cost share monies through CLEAR, again, which is under a CRP program. The NRCS, has the regular financial assistance programs that would cost share on saturated buffers, including EQIP and CSP, as well as the state soil and water conservation districts through Department of Ag funding have state cost share monies as well for saturated buffers. So those are some of the more traditional funding aspects, but we also have a lot of state level conservation partnerships right now that are cost sharing installation of these types of practices to help drive the awareness and implementation of them on the landscape. So for instance, Illinois Leica, just here in the last couple of years, we've been partnering with groups like the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership Illinois Farm Bureau, government agency, and university partners to get these installed, saturated buffers in particular, as part of larger field days.
Any advice for producers interested in installing a saturated buffer?
Yeah, I would say start the conversation early. Certainly by now, we hope that most producers are considering adopting an edge of field practice, really as a way to complement their in-field management, to reduce on-farm nutrient losses. And if you're a producer that's of that mindset, I think I'd encourage you to have that discussion and open dialogue now, if you're not already, with your families, your neighbors, your landlord, your drainage contract, soil and water, or NRCS staff, because, even though these saturated buffer practices don't really require a large time commitment to physically install, they do require some planning and designing to make sure they're a good fit for, your operation. So just encourage everyone to, kind of openly chat through this process. I think it's just going to allow you to learn more about the practice and then help you openly address any, upfront practice concerns that you may have with those that will really be helping you implement the practice on your farm.
Thanks so much, Ryan.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Todd.
Ryan Arch is the executive director of the Illinois Land Improvement Contractors Association, or Illinois LICA. Laura Christensen is a crop scientist at the University of Illinois. She's also been working with saturated buffers, getting some of the real raw numbers in place. I asked her just exactly what it is she does.
My tagline for what I do is that we help farmers do what they do best in growing crops while keeping water clean. So we're interested in reducing nitrogen and phosphorus that we send downstream from our farms here in Illinois.
How do you set about accomplishing that goal?
A large part of our research program involves farms across the state, both private farms and university research farms or partner farms, where we put conservation practices on the ground, and then we go out and monitor how well those conservation practices are working. That means we go out to these farms and collect water samples, bring them back to our lab, and analyze them to see how much nitrogen or phosphorus is in the water.
I know that you've been working with saturated buffers. Tell me about some of that research, please.
Well, saturated buffers is an important practice for us to be researching because it's a relatively new conservation practice over the last 5 or 10 years or so, and it's not a practice that's officially recommended in our state nutrient loss reduction strategy. The reason for that is because it's a new practice, and there just wasn't enough data or science and research to confirm that it should be included as a recommended practice or it should not be included as a recommended practice. And so with our saturated buffers across the state, we're currently monitoring 3. We go out to the site, we collect water samples, we look at how much water is getting routed into the saturated buffer, and then we analyze how well are these saturated buffers working. And towards the end of this year, really within the next 12 months or so, we're going to be digging deeply into our data to evaluate, is this a practice that we should recommend be added as a recommended practice in our nutrient loss reduction strategy.
I know you can't make a recommendation at this point, but do early indications point one way or the other?
Oh, yeah. Saturated buffers are a practice that works. That's clear. Nitrogen is removed by the practice of a saturated buffer. Now, they're not perfect, but no practice is perfect. And one of the hardest things is really in the siting of the saturated buffer. Finding the right site is kind of the limiting factor right now, because you have to have a buffer or be willing to put a buffer in. And then there's characteristics of the soil in the buffer that have to be right. And so the siting is really the sticky part right now. But yeah, definitely saturated buffers are a practice that work to clean nitrogen from tile drainage.
What is it exactly?
Well, it's really, in kind of scientific terms, where we reconnect the hydrology at the edge of the field. Traditionally, with our tile drains, we have tile pipes that go straight from the field. They go straight underground if you have a buffer between the field and the stream, and those tile pipes go straight underground underneath that buffer and send that drainage water straight out to the stream. With a saturated buffer, we cut into that tile pipe or that tile main, and we route water to the side. So rather than going through the pipe to the stream, the water actually gets rediverted to flow through the buffer's soil, so it just seeps slowly towards the stream. And when the water gets reconnected with how water would normally go to a stream, there's a lot of treatment that can happen with good microbes that live in the soil and plant uptake of the nitrogen and the water. And so we're just really kind of reconnecting the hydrology, or reconnecting how the water is supposed to get to the stream.
It's not a wetland.
No, and it's actually kind of a misnomer a little bit. I like the term saturated buffer, but it's a little bit of a misnomer because you're not saturating the buffer all the way up to the surface. It's not going to be squeechy and squelchy when you step out on there, which the name kind of implies. And it's certainly not a wetland. You're not raising the water table in the buffer all the way up to the surface by any means.
So it's just a lateral that allows the water to seep back into the soil profile?
That's right. That's right. It's just tile drainage working in reverse. But it is a powerful conservation drainage technology because your drainage system in the field can continue to function how you need that drainage system to function. But then at the edge of the field, you get this extra treatment for the nitrogen. So you get the drainage benefits, but you're also helping with our water quality.
Hey, thanks so much.
Thanks, Todd.
Laura Christensen is a crop scientist at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. She certainly is not the only researcher in the state looking at saturated buffers. We'll move next to Southern Illinois University and John Schoonover.
I'm John Schoonover. I'm a professor here in the College of Agricultural Sciences at Southern Illinois University. I've been here almost 15 years. I'm a native to Southern Illinois, attended SIU for my bachelor's and master's degree. Then I went off to Auburn University down in Alabama and ended up coming back here. I teach a couple classes in soils, 2 different forest soils classes, 3 watershed management classes, and a tree ID class here at SIU.
What are your research interests?
Well, my research interest is always focused on soils and water quality. Early on in my career, I did several projects with the Department of Defense looking at sediment movement on military bases, and then that led into a couple projects in urban areas where I looked at same type of issues, water quality, sedimentation, and hydrology. But my heart's kind of always been in agriculture. I grew up kind of on a farm with my grandparents, and I've always been trying to work with farmers to determine how different best management practices could be used to meet their water quality goals or increase their crop yields on their farm. So I've kind of always had a foothold there in agriculture, doing whether it's riparian buffers or these saturated buffers, cover crops, things of that nature.
Tell me about these saturated buffers and what they are, what kind of research you're doing with them.
Okay, our saturated buffer research, first of all, I'd like to thank the folks that have funded it. It's the Illinois Nutrient Research and Education Council. We've kind of collaborated on these projects with NRCS, the Illinois Farm Bureau, and the Illinois Land Contractors Association. So it's kind of been a joint effort putting these projects together. Our research goal has always been to kind of tweak the existing saturated buffer designs to see if we could make them more effective in terms of nutrient attenuation, and see if we can and kind of broaden the range where they could be applied. Because right now it's like there's only a few little parts of the state that these things are, suitable for based on organic matter and water table and saturated hydraulic conductivity and things of that nature. But we're trying to tweak those designs to where we can use them on a broader range of sites. So we've looked at a couple different designs. Our original thought was to use a 2-stage buffer where we had the two different control structures, where the typical saturated buffer just has a single control structure. We had 2. So the first one came in and the water came off the tile, and then kind of saturated a zone that we'd plant with cover crops where the farmer could go in and terminate those cover crops and then plant over that section. So we didn't take any land out of production on that first zone. And the second zone was more of a perennial grass that would stay there. So the land was taken out of production. So one of the things we found with that was, or the thing that we noticed most often, they worked great during low flow. We'd see reductions in the outlet flows, but then as the water would come up, the water tables rise, we tended to have a lot of backflow issues. So it looked like the dispersion lines were actually contributing to the outlets. So we'd actually increase the water leaving the system. So that's what kind of led into the next design where we had the saturated buffers, and we designed a new one. We call it the pitchfork buffer. And the reason is it kind of looks like a pitchfork. So it goes out laterally. Instead of having a single dispersion line like a standard buffer, it has a 3 dispersion lines. The one nearest the field edge, the farmers, they can farm over that, the outer line. We have a shut-off valve on it, so we can shut the water off so we don't push any water out there, so it kind of can dry off before they get in the field. And then for the whole system, we put in a backflow valve. So once the water goes out into that dispersion line, it can't return. So if the water table were to come up in that zone, it can't come back into our system. So that's been the biggest change. We're doing a side-by-side comparison right now up in Moultrie County, just off the north side of Lake Shelbyville. And what we've seen is the standard saturated buffer when we get, during the fallow time of the year, not a lot of evapotranspiration going on. We're seeing more contribution from those lateral lines to that system, whereas in the pitchfork design that's equipped with that backflow, we're not seeing this water return. So we're actually seeing water go out and no increases coming back. So that's kind of what we wanted to do with that design, is to show that it can, treat that water so it stays out there. So you got potential attenuation from plants, so uptake, and then you've also got the denitrification potential out there.
Any advice for producers about installing these saturated buffers?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing you got to do as a producer is make sure your field is suitable for it. Like I said, we're trying to broaden or widen the range of sites that we can put these on, but your tile system needs to be relatively shallow, so it needs to be 3 or 4 feet deep. Your outlet can't be, 12 feet down in the ditch, because it will get, water table will come up above that too often for it to function correctly. So we're looking for outlets in the 3 to 4 foot deep range, organic matter up in the 1.23% range to allow that water to move out there and to have enough carbon available for denitrification. The farmers also got to be willing to give up a little bit of that prime farmland. So if we're talking a 500-foot long dispersion line by 100 feet wide, that's 50,000 square feet. So a little bit over an acre of land that they'd be giving up, but they may be able to get some incentives with if they put pollinators in it, or in the future we're wanting to look into what if we put some perennial grass out there that they could harvest for hay. So if they have cattle on their farm, maybe they could remove some of that biomass. That biomass should be attenuating those nutrients, so we could remove those nutrients from the site before they became saturated. So, the other thing is the farmer's going to have to go out there and make a couple site visits, so they'll have to be willing to go out there and put the tile or the stop logs in the fallow time of the year to allow that water table to come up, and then pull them out, to go out there so they can get access to the field and dry it down a little bit before they get their equipment out there.
That's John Schoonover from Southern Illinois University. He's been working on new designs for saturated buffers. At Illinois State University, they have actually installed a saturated buffer on the university farm. Jason Lindbaum is the farm manager there, and Rob Reichert is an Illinois State University professor of agronomy and soil sciences. I asked them, and Rob answered this question, what the process was like to get that saturated buffer in place.
This was, Todd, this was a really cool project. It was a joint project. The Nature Conservancy actually contacted us to install this, and they were looking at setting up some demonstration sites around the state, and thought the Illinois State University farm would be a terrific location to have one. We're right here off the interstate, easy access, high visibility, and they had some funding, which was really nice. As you know, being associated with universities, funding is always tight. And so that really helped us out as well. So it didn't cost Jason much out of his pocket. And one thing as a former chair of the department, I always like to include is, the ISU farm has to be pretty much self-sufficient financially. And so since they brought some of the cost sharing in, this was a project that was pretty attractive to us. So from that, They got us in contact with some of the contractors that were able to put in the system itself. And I don't know, from there, pretty quick process once they came out.
It was. One thing, we had a 60-foot buffer side of the Turkey Creek that runs through our farm. It runs about almost a mile's length through our farm on the west side there. And we had it enrolled previously in a CRP program with the buffer strip, but being a state entity, we never received any funding for that. So when it came time to re-enroll, we took it out of that CRP program and just we're using it or developing that ground for just for beef cattle and our sheep flock. So with not having this buffer area and any contracts, it was really easy for the NRCS and the Nature Conservancy to work together in putting that in out there. So as far as the timeline to have it installed, I mean, they basically came out, they done some soil tests. They wanted to check the organic material in the soil, because you don't really want a high clay base in there to put that saturated buffer strip in with that perforated tile. So they done that testing. The install took less than a day. I mean, it basically came in. He entered our existing main tile, which is an 8-inch tile off of the covers, drains roughly 120 acres of the farm there. He entered into that. They put in that drop box there with the three slots or 3 compartments, and then just hooked up the 2,000 foot of the perforated tile, and they were in and out of here in no time. So.
What is the day-to-day management like?
And we really don't really manage it day to day. It's more seasonal. So come harvest time in the fall, we open those gates back up. We drain that field off so we don't have any water issues. Typically, you don't have any water issues in the fall. So basically, we come out there, we open that field back up. And then basically we can, so it's just basically the first gate, we lower those gates, basically open that up. So it's just dumping directly into that saturated strip of tile there. So then it come in the springtime, we kind of raise it up again during there after harvest there, kind of monitor it. But in the springtime from planting, if we do notice any wet spots out there before planting, we'll open it up, kind of drop that water table again out there, let that release into that tile. And then once planting is done, we raise those gates back up. So it's basically raises that water table out there when moisture is a crucial time, especially the period that we're going through right now during this kind of semi-drought that we're having.
Rob, do you like this idea? Does it make sense agronomically?
Absolutely. And I think especially if we take a step back and think of this in terms of the Illinois nutrient loss reduction strategy, this really ties in nicely with that. This is not intended to completely eliminate nutrient runoff from the state, but it's a little piece of it, right? So we're chipping away. So, Illinois, you probably know the numbers. Estimates are we're contributing, 15 to 20% of the nitrates that are getting into the Mississippi River and going down to the Gulf. And so, but if we can install these systems in along creeks and rivers, streams, and so forth, we can begin to chip away at the nutrient loss. It's a great step at beginning to reduce the nutrient runoff. So yeah, I'm a really big fan of this. I think this is terrific technology. And the thing I like the most about it, and you were alluding to this is simple technology. This isn't rocket science. This is, Jason can go out and in 10, 15 minutes, he can have a gate open or closed. That's pretty simple. It's well designed. It's one of these things. It's, why didn't I think of this type technology? It's so simple and works so well. and can be easily installed on existing tile lines that we have.
Rob Reichard is a soil scientist and agronomist at Illinois State University. He was joined by Jason Lindbaum at the Illinois State University Farm to talk about saturated buffers here on episode 28 of the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Podcast. The program was produced in conjunction with Illinois Extension Watershed Outreach Associates, Jennifer Woodyard-Jones and Haley Haverback-Gruber. As described in the State of Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy, Woodyard-Jones works in phosphorus priority watersheds, and Haverback-Gruber's work is with nitrogen priority watersheds. I'm Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason.